Okay, it's 12 o'clock on the dot, so let's get started. Happy Thursday, everyone. I'm Aran Hamilton, the chair of Identity North, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to the very first Identity North webinar. Our topic today is SMS One-Time Passcodes, and we received a huge response to the webinar when we posted the topic on identitynorth.ca. Part of that excitement, I think, is from the topic, and part of it is probably from the caliber of speakers today. Two exceptional leaders in digital innovation. Just before I introduce our panelists, let me say that our mandate here at Identity North is to educate and connect and just showcase innovative leaders. And this is a really great example of innovation in the digital identity space. I've known guys for a number of years, and I'm really excited by what they had to share with us today here. The webinar is going to run for about 20 minutes, and we're going to then follow that with a 10-minute Q&A session. Robert's going to share a PowerPoint presentation, which includes a video, and I'm going to collect any questions that you submit as we go along. At the end of the presentation, I will moderate the Q&A session, and we'll get through as many of the questions as we can. And then there'll be some opportunities for follow-up as well with the panelists afterwards. So feel free to use the conference tool as we go along to submit those questions, and then I'll get through them as we can. With that, let me introduce Robert Blumenthal, the Chief Identity Officer at EnStream, and Greg Bonin, the Vice President of Product and Data Science at Payfone. Robert, you want to take it away?
Sure. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks for helping set everything up. Just want to make sure everyone can see the slides we have online.
Looking great.
Okay, great. So today we're going to talk about SMS one-time passcodes. I'm going to make an assumption that anyone who's joined this webinar knows what that is, at least a little bit. Lots of people are using them. You see them with PayPal, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, the list goes on and on and on. And more recently by some of the financial services companies in Canada, especially after some of the data breaches in the last year or so. If what you want to do is verify that a user has a particular number, then apart from the somewhat clunky experience, it's actually a pretty good method to do that. On the other hand, if what you're trying to do is step up security for online services, then you need to know exactly what you're getting into. There are some benefits for sure, but there are some significant security issues. Before getting into it, maybe we should talk a little bit about the size and scope of identity theft in the first place. And to be clear, there are two issues at hand. One is identity theft per se, in terms of pretending that you're someone else when you first enroll with a service. That truly is identity theft. Maybe that may give you access to a new bank account or a credit card in someone else's name. The other part is account takeover of an existing account held by someone else. It's unclear exactly how much contributes to what. They tend to be interchangeable depending on the company that's being affected, but they are very significant. In either case, the fraud is very big. While the slide's a little bit dated and limited to the US, the number is measured in billions of dollars even in Canada. According to another study, the average direct cost of data breach is about $8 million per incident, or about $150 per account. This excludes any post-breach response costs and any reputational costs to the companies that are being affected. There's another report by Cybersecurity Ventures that estimates the total cost of global cybercrime will go up to $6 trillion by 2021. That's up by double since 2015. So this is getting to be very, very significant. So a little bit about two-step authentication. Now, SMS passcodes are really just a form of that, intended to combat account takeover due to weak passwords and password reuse. There are many ways to do this, including old-fashioned hardware token generators, if you remember the Secure ID days, the software equivalent of that using Google Authenticator, as well as a number of other security apps by people like Duo, LastPass, Transact, or even Microsoft has one now. Why this is all important: the average user has 92 online accounts and passwords. The same user on average has only 2 to 3 unique passwords, and most of those are variations on the same password. Even with that, 63% of logins have forgotten passwords, which means a password reset yet another opportunity for someone to hack your account. In fact, if a hacker can get one password from one account online, there's a high probability that they can simply tumble through all of your online accounts using the same variation of passwords. So this is why it's a problem. Now, why SMS one-time passcodes? Well, in a world where everyone has a mobile phone, it's cheap and scalable, unlike hardware tokens that used to be prevalent for enterprise applications. And they don't require any preloaded software on the phone. It generally provides a consistent user experience in that it's just a text message with a code. Everyone's doing it, so there's some comfort that you don't have to train your customers on yet another new method. So from that perspective, it's very good. I think I'll just add at this point, the folks at IdentityNORTH are going to send out two polling questions as part of the webinar. The first is, have you already or are planning shortly to deploy SMS one-time passcodes as an additional security measure for online authentication? The second is, if you are doing that, do you have any strategy or solution to address things like SIM swap fraud and mobile number change, which I'm going to talk about in the next little bit. So you should see those online polls in the next little bit. I'm going to start with my own bank example. I don't mean to pick on TD Bank in particular. I'm a good and loyal customer for over 20 years. I just happened to be their customer, and they launched SMS one-time passcodes in the last number of months. It's a relatively simple process once I elected to use the two-step authentication process. First, I log in to my account using my usual username and password. Next is a display that lets me choose between a phone call or a text message. If I choose text, then I get a message to my phone with a passcode that I enter into the next screen displayed by TD. If the passcode entered is the same that the one was sent, then all is good and I get into my account. Behind the scenes, everything assumes that one, I've already enrolled with two-step authentication in the first place. Two, that the phone number is still valid and owned by the account holder, which may be an issue because people change their numbers quite regularly. And three, there's no funny business going on in the background like malware on my phone that intercepts the SMS. In the case that I choose a phone call on my phone, but my phone wasn't forwarded. So that was the happy path. Unhappy path, well, and I've experienced these even with the service as it was being rolled out. And being the paranoid security geek that I am, I enabled SMS passcodes for both web and mobile. It worked some of the time. I got the please try again message a few times. When it's slow, I click on a button a couple times and I get a whole bunch of new SMSs with new codes. Of course, it's a bit of a challenge trying to figure out which code I should use. On mobile, well, that's a whole other level of confusion, especially when it doesn't work, because I have to read the pop-up and write that down on a piece of paper, put that into the app or what have you. Again, I don't want to pick on TD in particular since the experience is not that different at the dozens of other services using SMS passcodes. It's just the nature of the beast, and I happen to use this as a local Canadian example. So now what are the issues apart from the user experience and particularly relevant to security? Some of you may have already heard about SIM swap fraud. That's where someone takes over your cell phone account so they can get the SMS passcodes. It's become very prevalent in the UK and the US and other markets. If your phone has certain malware, it can also redirect the SMS to another device. In either case, since you enter the passcode into the same screen as your password, you've actually done nothing to combat phishing, where the site you go to is pretending to be the site you actually want to go to. They'll collect your username, your password, and the SMS all in one go. And that's particularly important where people are reusing passwords. As I talked about before, if I use the same password across dozens of sites, if I get hacked at one site, a hacker can then tumble through other sites, and now where they're protected by SMS passcodes can use these other ways of getting into my account. So of course it begs a question. Most US and European regulators are actively discouraging using SMS passcodes as a method. So are Canadian companies just getting around to using it? To paraphrase Wayne Gretzky, we're playing where the puck is, not where the puck will be. This is particularly concerning since the hackers all know how to get around SMS passcodes. They've had lots of experience in other markets. They can do it quickly and efficiently. It sure feels like we're setting ourselves up for failure by introducing technologies that are well known to hackers. So we have to be very careful about that. And by way of example, I'll let Greg from Payfone talk about an experience from a Bitcoin wallet hack. As Aran mentioned, Greg is Vice President of Product and Data Science at Payfone, one of our EnStream's partners based in the US and one of the leading digital identity companies helping banks, health insurance companies, and others combat fraud using signals from mobile operators and other data sources. Greg, feel free to walk us through this example.
Great, thank you, Robert.
Shall I start the video?
No, give me 1 second. The video is rather quick, and so I want to explain the context of what you're going to see before we go through it. So what you're going to see here is an example, a real example of somebody hacking into somebody's Bitcoin account. Now, Bitcoin is a particular challenge for consumers since there's no way they're going to get their money back if that happens. I don't know if most folks have probably seen the news already that there's some person suing AT&T for allowing a SIM swap attack to happen for around $200 million because they lost about $20 million in Bitcoin. So this is an example of exactly how that would be done. Now this example actually shows a fairly sophisticated method using something called SS7 hacking, which I'll walk through as it goes. You can go ahead and start the video now, Robert. Right, so you see that you need to know relatively little information even about this customer. So what they start to do is they're going to try the Bitcoin site has a password reset that goes through email. And so what they're going to try to do is they're going to try to get access to the person's Gmail account, which is protected by two-factor authentication. So they're going into Gmail and they're asking to have an SMS sent to reset the password. And what they're doing here is they've hacked into the SS7 network, and they're basically intercepting the SMS code, and they're just reading the password and then being able to get into the person's email. Once they're able to get into the email, and they go through a couple steps of doing this, now they can receive the password reset notification into this person's Gmail account, and then they can simply reset the password on the Bitcoin account. So this is a known attack vector. So you can see now what they do is they have the password reset, it's changed, and they can log straight in to the Bitcoin account. And then boom, as soon as your Bitcoin is, I guess there's still one more step here. But as soon as they're into your Bitcoin account, there's nothing you can do. They have full access, they can transfer the money, they can do whatever. And since Bitcoin is completely anonymous, there's no way to then be able to recover that information. So there you go. So this is actually a relatively complex version of the attack where the hacker has gotten access into the SS7 network, which is a back end of the telephony system. The telephony system isn't designed to really be secure for these kind of attacks because SMS was never designed to solve this. But there's actually several much simpler methods that don't involve any kind of technical know-how at all that can be used to get into to beat an SMS one-time password. So the first and the one that you're probably hearing the most about is a SIM swap. So what all these attacks require is they social engineer the network operators themselves. So what they do is they'll call up and they say, hey, my SIM card broke, or I got a new phone, and I need to replace the SIM card. Will you please allow me to do that? And with relatively low, like just knowing an account number and maybe first name, last name, very little information, you can convince, you can get on the phone with a customer service representative and they'll let you do that because they want to make it easy for you to do that. So as soon as you've done that, you've effectively taken control over their phone. In some ways, it's even better than the SS7 attack because the person that's intended to receive the SMS will not actually get one at all. In a similar vein, people also use porting. So that's shifting from one carrier to another to do the exact same thing. And same thing, I could go to, using a US example, I could go to T-Mobile and say, hey, I want to transfer my AT&T phone to T-Mobile. They are happy to do that because they want to win your business. And then once again, they've taken over your phone. So I'm going to go to the thing. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and Greg, this is a great example. There's actually quite a number of different things happening here. The password reuse problem is letting somebody go and take over somebody's Gmail account and get that. And there's the fact that SMS is being used at the Bitcoin exchange, and getting that and hacking into SMS through one of multiple methods. So there's lots of things going on here, all of which are taking advantage of the fact that passwords are weak. The SS7 as a method is interceptable, and we're not actually dealing with any kind of phishing or any of those other issues that are prevalent online.
Yeah, those are all very good points, Robert. So you'll actually know that this example is in some ways a little bit outdated because it uses a password reset through email. That is actually no longer an acceptable method according to NIST, the main standards organization around this, as a second factor, because it's not really truly a second factor. It's just protected by a password. So it's no different. And since password reuse, just like Robert is saying, it's really no different than, if you know any password, you can get in to begin with.
Yeah, exactly. So just in terms of how do we help support this? So if you're down the path of using SMS passcodes today, there are actually things that can help with that from a mobile network signals perspective. The two things that I'll mention here is, one is mobile identity verification. So the mobile operators in Canada and the US and elsewhere are now exposing information about mobile subscribers with their consent, so that you can actually compare a mobile number that they have on file with name, address, and phone number, so that you can match records held at your company as well. And that gives you a higher level of assurance that the person with that phone number is who they say they are. The second part is around a mobile network account integrity, or trust score, as Payfone calls it. And this is a score that lets you know whether the phone number in question is active and in good standing, or whether there's been any account changes recently that could have been due to a SIM swap, or number change, a device change, or anything like that that could be a function of an account takeover. So these two things, these types of services are available today, that if you are using SMS One-Time Passcodes, these can help protect you using those codes beyond what you're already doing today.
Yeah, could I add a little bit onto that, Robert? Yeah. So many banks in the U.S. use both of these kind of services in order to help with SMS account takeover and just being able to register phone numbers for use in general. So the first thing that people usually do, and like three of the top 5 U.S. banks use Payfone services to do this, is when you enroll a phone into your account, either to be used for SMS one-time passwords or even just to use for outbound calling, you should verify ownership of that phone to begin with. And you can do that through through services like EnStream and Payfone, where we can reach out to the operators on your behalf and help verify the ownership of that device. So it's very, very common use in the US. It helps significantly from a fraudster not just putting their own phone in order to receive an SMS. There's some embarrassing examples from that. Even with the US carriers, where, for example, they would allow you to use a second device and forward text messages, which is another avenue to attack SMS OTPs. And in order to add a device, all they would do is they would do an SMS OTP to the device you wanted to add, which of course the fraudster already had possession of. So that won't work. And then along the second piece, like Robert had mentioned, like protecting against SIM swap fraud, is very critical. And so knowing when the devices change, when the SIMs change, et cetera, all of which are available from the carriers.
And Greg, your first example there, even calling up a bank and pretending to be someone is not that hard. They're using generally known information. And all they'd have to do is then say, oh, I've changed my mobile number. Here's the new number. And they update the account. And now the hacker has access to your account.
Yeah. And, you know, another thing that you mentioned earlier, Robert, that's a challenge is recycled numbers. So you should periodically at least review whether the phone numbers are still owned by that consumer, because people do change numbers fairly often. And at least at scale, it happens quite frequently. And when they do that, you can have unintentional access into people's accounts. So for example, if you change your number and then they send an SMS to that number, it'll go to the wrong person. And many companies, including large tech companies like Lyft in the US, suffer from this kind of challenge. So Payfone actually has a product that we can actually push those changes to you, so you do not have to continuously send PII across, which tell you whether a phone has been recycled or not.
Couple of case studies, Greg?
Yeah, so the first example of a Bitcoin exchange is a great one, since Payfone works with one of the leading Bitcoin exchanges in the US to prevent exactly this kind of fraud. So they were getting hit very hard, not necessarily by SS7 hacking, which is, again, rather sophisticated, but by SIM swap fraud. It's very, very easy. You know, like I mentioned before, once you're in somebody's account, the Bitcoin is just gone and there's nothing anybody can do to recover it. And so these folks were experiencing, you know, tens if not hundreds of attacks a day on SIM swaps. So what they would social engineer the call center, like I mentioned before, get them to change their SIM and then pass an SMS OTP and be out in 5-10 minutes. So they implemented Payfone's solution in order to stop this, which would tell them whether there's been a SIM swap since the last time they logged in. And by doing that, they essentially completely shut down this attack vector. They implemented this late last year, and they've not had a single account takeover due to SMS OTP since then. So it's a great example and relevant to the video that we watched. Another example is comes from the mobile peer-to-peer payment systems. So you can think like Venmo or Zelle or things like that, where you're allowing users to exchange money via an app. And so again, the app is usually on a phone tied to a phone number. And so this can cause all the same sorts of problems that you can have. And Payfone, so one of the leading providers of this in the US, uses the SIM swap and device change detection to prevent payments. If there's, for example, been a port or a device change or a SIM swap within the last 24 hours, it won't let you use that phone number in order to initiate money transfers. And that has been very effective in stopping those kind of attacks.
Yeah, and Greg, we should probably point out that there are a lot of solutions and technologies on the market today that will use a device-based information in order to determine whether things have been swapped or changed. Or
yeah, good point.
like, the problem with all of those things is, you know, at the operating system level, you know, it can get hacked. It's not 100% reliable. Where mobile network information becomes valuable is, number one, it's not on device. It's completely independent from the device. And in order for the mobile provider to provide service of the phone in the first place, it has to have a very strong level of authentication with the device. So when you're using these mobile network signals, you're getting a truly out-of-band, device-independent authentication solution in order to verify that the user is who they say they are when connected to the network.
Yeah, and you know, so that's great for the fraud prevention side. All of that is good, and I'm glad that you added that, Robert. There's also a friction implication on a lot of those kind of device ID based solutions. They're usually based around IP address primarily, or you know, fingerprinting the OS or something like that, and they tend to work very poorly with mobile devices. And so the cause of that is you end up locking your customer out or doing step-up authentication much more frequently than you would like to. Since none of this is tied to the device itself and it's all tied to the network, you don't have to do that. And for example, I'm sure everybody's been through the experience on Amazon or something like that, where you get a new phone and you have to now do a new SMS one-time password to get in. Using network solutions, you don't need to do that because it's not tied to the actual device. It's tied to the account between the consumer and the phone company.
Exactly. And just for those of you listening on the line, statistically, there's about 50 to 60% of people will change their phones every year. And of that, a significant percentage, probably a quarter to a third, are actually changing their mobile number at the same time. So in a market like Canada with 30 million mobile subscribers, that's 15 million plus device changes per year, and probably 5 to 6 million number changes in that same year. So this affects everybody who's operating services at scale.
That's a very surprising statistic for me, Robert. I didn't realize it was quite that high. We've got a couple of questions that have come in. Did you want to cover other slides here, or do you want to dive into the questions?
Yeah, I think we have 2 more slides left, and then
Sure.
we can cover off. So the last things that really just teeing off of what Greg was talking about is ultimately replacing SMS OTP. You can certainly enhance it in some of the solutions we talked about. Replacing it is ultimately where you want to go. Certainly on device, the network knows what the actual phone number of that device is, and that is in fact only the network knows. And so if you want to regularly check what the mobile number is of the device, or as a method to have if you like, a silent second factor, or another alternative is using what we have as essentially mobile ID tokens that provide a persistent token that represents that user, whether they're on the mobile network or as well as on Wi-Fi, to ensure that the mobile device and the network connection, the mobile account, can be trusted. Greg also mentioned that we have notification services. So if anything changes, like the mobile device or the SIM or the mobile number, or the user account has been suspended, this information can be pushed to a subscriber of these services, so that you can anticipate a potential either a regular event or a potential fraudulent event that's happening. Along with a trust score that we talked about before, this can be used as a powerful way to authenticate to online services as a primary credential or as a silent second factor. It's easy to use and simple for consumers. It's in the background. There's no SMS OTPs required in any of this, either from a user experience perspective and from a security perspective. It is much more elegant than what people are deploying today.
Can I add a little something to that, Robert, which
Yep.
is a specific example? There's one of the very largest banks in the U.S. uses this this solution as part of their their app login in order to avoid sending SMSs. So every time they log into the app, it passively authenticates them to like an even higher level of assurance than what an SMS one-time password would be, by figuring out that the device connecting to them is actually the number of their customer. So it's used quite a bit. And there's another bank actually this week rolling out the same solution as a very passive, consumer-friendly way of doing this. It would be a pain in the butt if you got to text every time you want to log into your account.
Absolutely, and great example there. And we'll distinguish this as this is not like having a cookie or a device-based cert. No. This is using off-device, network-based authentication mechanism that really is binding the device to the network and then the network to the application. And that way you can have certainty that the device is the original device that was enrolled in the service. So really just to close off here, the choice ultimately is yours. If you're going down the path of implementing or planning to implement SMS OTPs, you can do nothing and leave it where they are, but I would certainly recommend that you prepare for the onslaught of what will be hacks for sure, or you can go to where the puck is, where the puck will be, and enhancing your existing passcodes with a mobile identity verification or trust score, and ultimately replace SMS as a second factor using next generation authentication services. So really, whatever is being done now, we need to look into the future and be very quick to move forward on what will certainly be hacks on these SMS OTPs. And with that, Aran, maybe we can open it up for questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, thank you, Robert. Thank you, Greg. That was great. Let's have a quick look at those questions that have come in. First of all, there was a couple of folks that had asked if the webinar would be recording would be available, and the answer is yes, it will be available. And also, I think a couple of people were wondering if they'd be able to get a copy of the slides separately. So I'll leave that to you to answer if you would be willing to make some of the slides available to folks.
Perfect.
So you okay with that, Robert?
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, we'll work with you to make sure that you've got people's contact information for that. As you can see, Robert's contact info is right there on the screen, as is Greg's. So feel free to reach out to them personally. Also, if you have follow-up questions. One of the questions that was submitted was, how do you handle the fact that primary account owner of a telco account is not necessarily the holder of the phone? So, you know, an example of a parent or a child relationship or corporate accounts, things like that.
That's Robert, do you mind if I take first pass at that one?
Absolutely, go ahead.
Yeah, we get this question all the time, and it's a great question. So really, there's a couple different ways that you could do this, and this is really critical, is that you can't strictly rely on telco or mobile information in order to fully authenticate people because of exactly the reasons you said. So the child parent information is a little bit easier because you can handle a lot of that through sophisticated matching algorithms and householding. So I figure out if you have the same last name and you live at the same address, for example, then it's probably a child of the person and not some random fraudster that's attacking you. But really the primary way of dealing with these kind of challenges is by using other third-party information to confirm ownership of devices. And so what we do at Payfone is we use other data sources, which I'll call like association data sources, which will tell you that a phone number has been previously associated for a certain amount of time with the customer. So for example, it's part of a bank account, or it was used to apply for a credit card, or it's used to pay bills, or things like that. That's not exactly the same thing as proving ownership of the device like you would with a telco data source, but it can help as a second factor to resolve some of these weird cases where it's a corporate phone or somebody's kid or something of that nature. Robert, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. So, Canada actually is a very good market from the perspective of mobile, and that 90% of mobile users are postpaid users, meaning they have monthly bills. And then the remaining 10%, which are prepaid, half of those approximately are on credit card billing. So the telcos here do a reasonably good job at verifying ID and doing credit checks for all the primary account holders. For the secondary users, as Greg said, there are methods to go and look at the secondary information to help with that. But I would say that you also have to look at statistically who's applying for which kinds of accounts. We're seeing somewhere between 70 to 80% match rates, in particular for financial services, because it tends to be the primary account holders on mobile who are also the applicants for online financial services and similar. And so if you can use that, and I would certainly agree with Greg that it's never to be used as a sole source of data, but certainly as a secondary, independent, reliable source, it can be a very, very good way of doing that. Plus, you're verifying that the mobile number is active and held by an account that you can verify. The other comment I'll make is we do need to distinguish between identity versus authentication. While we may have, as I said, 70, 80% match rates on identity, there's 100% probability or matching or connection as it relates to some of the device-based and network-based information that the telcos have. And so when you've done your own onboarding of a customer, and you've done whether it's KYC or the equivalent in other industry sectors, once you are convinced that the user is who they say they are, now the question is, how do you get an authentication device, a trusted mobile number that you can use either from a contact perspective or from an authentication perspective for that user? And that can be done at 100% of the time.
Yeah, I'll say another common thing that people do is which is not, we don't totally love it, but it does make sense for some of these edge cases, is that once you're logged in and have gone through an authenticated session, then you can allow people to add other devices if it's an odd kind of device where you wouldn't be able to verify the identity another way. Since they've already authenticated, you can believe them.
That's a good thought there. Hey, so we received the other question, another question here that says for Payfone service, how do you handle it when the financial institution already has something like a USSD or VAS aggregator in place? How do you plug in between the aggregator, the institution, and the telco?
So usually that's not too much of an issue because they're trying to accomplish something a little bit different. Like we try to avoid sending text messages when we can, although we do have a method for handling that for like companion devices, for example. But so we're not primarily in the business of like actually serving up text messages or serving up the communication services. Instead, what we focus on is doing the mobile authentication in the background. So sometimes we'll work with those folks in order to do the integration itself, but oftentimes they're run by different teams or run through different spots, at least in the US.
I think that's good clarification there.
And if I understand the question correctly, if you've implemented, an SMS OTP or USSD or something like that, these services will be supplemental to those, and it's done in the path of the authentication, but not necessarily integrated with whatever the existing provider is.
Yeah, exactly.
So one last question here that if I had to guess, I would guess it may have been Kim Ador on the chat platform, and pointing out that those stats around changing phone numbers is still really high. It seems really high in Canada, considering that we can now port our numbers across MVNOs or MMNOs. Any sense of what the drivers might be for changing those phone numbers so frequently?
Yeah, so the primary driver for phone number changes tends to be where these are business phone numbers, or people are moving from one location to another. So I'm moving from Toronto to Montreal. I want to get a Montreal number. So those are the two big drivers of number changes. Is so I've got a company number. I change companies. The company gives me a new phone, and it's going to be a different number. Personal phones, certainly numbers are held longer than that, and assuming you still want to be contacted by your friends and family, and there are cases clearly that people want to be not found.
Yeah. So in all of there's a lot of trickiness around even a porting situation. There was another question around the window of porting, which we can support now in the US, or we'll be able to very soon, like porting information. Right now there can be up to like a 2-minute delay between when the port happens and when we get access to it. Soon that will be within seconds. But more generally, porting can be very confusing because oftentimes you see a disconnect that comes in from the previous carrier, well, then it ports to another one. So you have to be very careful about making sure that you're tracking that over time. And Payfone and EnStream have sophisticated systems to do that, to make sure that you're not like losing the tenure of the person as they port across devices. Because frequently US banks will treat recently ported customers or short tenured phones rather as being very risky. And you don't want to confuse that with a recently ported number. So if you just got your number 2 days ago, 3 days ago, maybe that's very suspicious. Whereas if you just ported from one carrier to another 3 days ago, that's much less suspicious. So being able to distinguish between those is important for
so information like activation date versus date of, you might change a SIM because of a new device. It's got a different format of SIM. You might change your mobile number even though it's the same account. So all that lower level information is available. It's also available as a roll-up in what we would describe as either the trust score or a confidence score around the account information related to the user's tenure at the particular telco.
Yeah, and what's actually risky behavior versus what might seem risky to someone who's not as familiar with the telecom telephony system is important. That's the reason why we provide that roll-up, since since both us and EnStream have a good sense of what's actually risky behavior versus not.
Exactly.
So last question that we'll put it there as we wrap up is around from someone named Nikki asking if there was any advice regarding prepaid and postpaid around SMS and or OTP. I mean, I think you've kind of answered this a little bit with basically talking about the fact that you're not encouraging people to use those technologies, but to do authentication on the back end. Is there other things that you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I think, again, it goes back to the comment of separating out identity versus authentication. The identity component is complex, depending on the type of organization that you are, whether you're doing any in-person enrollment or online enrollment, and the strength of that enrollment in the first place. And we have data that can help support that in terms of telco data relating to the authority on phone numbers will be the telco, and we'll have the billing address, at least for a very large part of those users. So identity is one piece. Authentication around, once I've identity proofed someone, now I want to attach a device, I want to attach a mobile number for either contact purposes or authentication purposes. That's where it's actually independent of whether it's prepaid or postpaid. Because the authentication is all about, is this number still active? Is it trustworthy? When was it activated? How long has it been there? Was there a SIM swap recently? All of those types of things are independent of the identity of the person. It's purely dealing with the device and the network connection. And that covers 100% of those devices.
Yeah, so in the US, at least, the concern generally around prepaid devices is around there's a lack of identity information. Like Robert is saying, you need to separate out identity versus authentication, which is true, or at least if there is identity information, it might say Mickey Mouse or Donald Trump or something like that is the name. So that's a big part with Payfone, where we use our third-party data sources to try to confirm the identity of that person. And then the option is, if you're unable to confirm the identity and you don't want to allow them to add that device, you could use the method I mentioned earlier, which is you make them, assuming they have another way of logging in and authenticating themselves, you can let them add the phone number only after they've done some sort of other authentication.
And I think the strategy here, going right to the question, the strategy here, we all have to think about the 80-20 rule. Go after the 80% of customers that are going to be down the happy path, that are using legitimate devices, and make their life easier. The 20%, which today for a lot of people is 100% poor ways to authenticate, you'll continue along the same path that you're on and improving it for the 20%, but at least solve the problem for the 80%.
Very good. Well, listen, thanks again, Robert and Greg. This has been really, really interesting and quite eye-opening. I want to thank everyone for joining us. This is the very first webinar in our series. The next one will be in October, featuring ForgeRock. We're also a few weeks away from the IdentityNORTH Eastern Workshop in Halifax on October 2nd and 3rd, and we have a lot of great speakers lined up. We're going to be exploring a number of really neat topics around digital ID and authentication. We have speakers from across Canada and folks coming from the digital government, vital statistics, credential departments from each of the 4 Atlantic provinces, as well as some really interesting talks on e-health or digital health, and also online voting. So I encourage you to go visit the website at identitynorth.ca to look at the agenda, perhaps get some tickets, and we hope to see you there. Have a great afternoon, everyone.